This video is for the ChangeCube lab. In this video, we are going to work on several methods that are going to return values. Some of them will help us to change the color of the ground or a cube. Some of them will change the scale, rotation, and position of a cube. That's kind of our objective for this lab. So let's get started. We're told that we need to create in our Unity project a ground placed at the origin with a scale of 2 on all axes, and then a cube with a position of 2 units above the origin, and then add a rigid body to it. So let's get started. I've already started the Unity project here, and I've named it Lab Change with my last name. One of the little things that I like to do is change the name of the scene. I'm going to call it ChangeCube Scene. Unity is going to ask me if I want to reload it. Sure. And then this way I don't have this sample scene created. So let's start by creating a plane, which strangely is placed under 3D objects. We are going to rename it ground. And then it's placed at the origin already, but we're going to set its X, Y, and Z to 2 in all directions. I'm going to create some a cube now, still in the scene. So we're told for this one, the position along Y needs to be 2 so that it's above the ground. And then I'm going to call it Changing Cube because it's going to be changing. And then I'm going to assign to it a rigid body. There it is. It'll use gravity. This way, when we start, it should fall through the ground. If we press play right now, we should see it just fall to the ground. The colors are not that great to get started. So let's add some materials. I'm going to create, in my assets folder, I'm going to create another folder. And I'm going to call it materials. And I'm just going to create a couple. Create a material. I'm going to call it, I don't know, a blue material. And I'm going to change this albedo to be in the blue tones. There it goes. And I'm going to create another material. And I'm going to call it the yellow material. And I'm going to change its color so it's in the yellow tones. Bright yellow. I'm going to assign to the ground a blue material. You can just drop it on it. And then same thing on the cube. There it goes. This way. That looks a little bit nicer. Not required, but it looks nicer. Okay, so next let's actually focus on the requirements. If I look at the requirements, we are to have 2 UI elements, a quit button and a reset button. That's pretty simple. If we're looking at the user interface that's displayed for us, they're located towards the bottom right, of the screen. So let's add them. Let's add a button. Let's call it the quit button. And let's change its text to quit. I'm going to, well, I don't want to go to the next line here. I'm going to anchor it to the bottom right corner by pressing Shift Alt, and then this way it'll be anchored to the right corner of the screen. If I look at the game view, I can see my button. It's a little bit on the low side, so maybe I can change the position. If I add 20, it'll be a little higher, and maybe -20 for the X. That gives it a position a little offset from the bottom right corner. Next, we're going to add our reset button. So going under Game Object, UI, and then add another button. I'm going to rename it the reset button. and then I'm going to change its text to say reset. There it goes. I'm going to anchor it as well to the bottom right corner. And then this time I'm going to change, well, the X can still be -20. This way they're lined up. Maybe for the Y I can use 60. That would work out a little bit better. There he goes. You can alter these as needed. It's not really the main focus here on this lab. So I have the next requirement, my UI buttons. That's great. They've been renamed. Next, I need to have a game controller and a game controller script. And then we'll identify what we need to do for these. So let's go back to the Unity project. Let's add to the scene an empty game object. I'm going to rename it game controller as required. And then I'm going to, in my assets folder, I'm going to create another folder. And then this one will be for the scripts. Make sure you keep your projects organized. And then I'm going to create a C# script that I'm going to name game controller as well. And since I'm added, I'm going to attach the game controller script. I'm going to also reset the transform, as I don't like having values there when it's an empty game object. I like the component to be reset just as a force of habit. So I think we've got pretty much everything that we need in the scene, and now it's time to work on our project. I'm going to save the scene and save the project very quickly here. And I'm going to double click to open up our game controller, and so that we can start preparing for coding the project. Visual Studio is going to take a minute or two on my machine to start up. It shouldn't be anything new, and actually it won't even open the script. Let's try this again. There we go, that's a little bit better. So now we have the game controller script. Let's take a look at the requirements. So here we are only allowed to have public variables for the UI. No other class variables are required. I don't need anything for the start event. In the update, I can only use something for the mouse clicks. And then there's several methods that I need. The on quit button click, on reset button click, check mouse click. So let's add these as we go. So no start. In the update, we're only going to have for checking the mouse click. We'll handle that later on. So we're going to keep the update. Next, we need to have the button handlers, basically. So those don't need to return anything, and they need to be public so I can see them from the button. On quit button click. And then I can have here, well, we already know, let's just have a statement that prints something so that we know our button has been connected correctly. I can't spell application apparently this morning. And then do the application.quit. This way that's done. Let's do the other button. That's a quick and easy thing to do, so I might as well get it out of the way. I'll reset button click, and here well, we're going to need to reload the scene. So to reload the scene, I need a scene manager. So let's make sure that we import that. Unity engine .scene management. This way I have access to the scene manager. And what we're going to do is we're going to call the scene manager .load scene. And then we're going to load the current scene. So I could use the index, or I could use the name of the scene. I'm going to use the name of the scene. So I need to use the scene manager .get active scene. That gives me a reference to the current scene, and then I can use the name of that scene to reload it. So that should be visible in the user interface, so no need to have a debug statement for it. Let's take a look at the other methods that we need. So let's have check mouse click and pick random. So let's add them. They're going to be called within the script, so they don't need to be public. and we can always change that if we find that we need them to be public, but they should only be called within the script. Check mouse click. What was that? Pick random was the next one. Now this one, I forgot the void. That could be important. Make sure that we have our return type first. All right, that's for the methods that we're going to need. So the check mouse click is going to check when I click. And depending on what I click on, I'm going to call different methods. If it's the ground, I'm going to change its color. And if it's the cube, then I'm going to determine randomly whether I'm going to change its scale, its position, or its color. So let's go back to taking a look at the requirement. Here we're going to need those 4 methods that are going to return values. The random color is going to return a color, and then random position, rotate, and scale are going to return a vector 3. So let's work on these and setting them up, and then we'll figure out a little bit the requirements. So let's go back to our script here. So we have 4 methods, is it? So one is returning a color, and then random color is the name of it. And I get a red squiggly line under random color where all code paths are not returning a value, which makes sense because I'm not returning anything. So I can just set up already this a color to return, and then I can assign to it for now a color that would be my error color. I guess I could do red too, and then return to return. I can do the same thing for the other methods. The next ones are needing to return vector 3s. So there is a random position. I'm going to call it to return as well. It could be called something a little bit more meaningful, but this is fine. It's a local variable. It doesn't really have a great use, except that's something that I need to return. And I'm going to maybe I'll assign 0, 0, 0 for now, just to have something as a placeholder so I don't have those red squiggly lines. And then make sure to have the line to return that value. And I can actually copy this and set it up for the other ones. So we set a private method to return a vector 3 again, and this one will be random rotation. And it can just have this vector for now. We'll work on changing the vectors momentarily. The last one that we need here is for rotating. So random rotate. And then for now we're going to use this vector, and then we'll adjust that as needed. So let's start working on the Let's start with working with the colors, and then we'll implement that, and then we'll move along as we go. So the random color is going to be, for now, we have a color to return. We're going to set it to white. So if we see something white in our code afterwards, that means that something went wrong. To determine a random color, we're going to need a random number. So that's very simple. Let me double check the instructions here quickly to make sure that however many colors we need to choose from. So we need to return out of a selection of 5 colors. It's kind of important to determine what that random number is going to be. I'm going to define one. It's going to be using random.range. And then I need to pick a value, maybe from 0 to 4. So I'm going to start at 0, and then remember, when I use integers, the maximum value is not included, so If I pick from 0 to 5, it'll give me value between 0 and 4 included. So after this, I can either have a series of if and else if statements, or I can have a switch, whichever you would rather use. So I'm going to use a switch. I'm going to switch on the random number. And then I'm going to have my case. So case 0, I'm going to have to return is going to be color dot, let's do green. And then I need to break. Then I have case 1, where I can set to return to be color dot red, maybe, and break for that case. Then I can have case 2, where to return is going to be color dot blue. I already have blue. Magenta, and then break. Case 3, I'm going to set, let's see if we have some interesting colors offered. Cyan, that's a good color. And break. And then last case, case 4, to return, we're going to set that to be, I think gray is a color. There it goes. It's kind of a little sad color, but there we go. So I have different cases, and then I return my value, and I don't need a default case because I've already set up the color. I've assigned already the color white to it, so I don't really need a default case. If none of the colors are being called, then the return value will be white. So I can set it up that way. That works just fine. Let's call it. So how do we call this function? Well, we have to kind of click here. So what I'm going to do is in my update, I'm going to check if I have a mouse click. And if I have a mouse click, oh, actually, I have to call check mouse click in the way that this is set up. And then in the check mouse click, I'm going to need to check if I have a mouse click. So that's input.get mouse button. You can use up or down. I'm going to use down. Remember, 0 is the left button, 1 is the right, and 2 is the middle, I think. So if I have clicked, then I need to raycast and see to find out what I have clicked exactly. So to do that, we need to define a ray. And we use the camera.main. The screen point to ray, and then I need to give a position. I'm going to use the position of the mouse, so that's pretty simple. Mouse position, there it goes. Then I need to have raycast hit information if I hit something with the raycast. So I'm going to call it hit info to kind of match what we've done before. Next, I need to check if I'm actually hitting something. If I cast a ray from the camera to wherever I have clicked. If I have hit something, I need to check what it is and then identify what I have hit or not. So let's start to work on this portion. Of course, I'm going to need to start working on some tags, as you can probably forecast. So I need array. I need the hit info. And then I need the distance. Well, we've been using 100 float. I think that's fine for here. So if that's the case, I need to check what I've hit. And then if you remember, when I set up the objects, I did not provide a tag for any of them. So I'm going to save my script. There's no errors, so I shouldn't have any issues back in Unity. And then I'm going to tag my ground and my cube. So I'm going to add the 2 tags here. I'm going to use cube, and I'm going to use ground for those tags, and then make sure I go back and select the ground and change its tag now to ground, and grab the cube and change its tag to cube. So this way they're tagged, and when I click on them, I should identify which I've clicked. So let's go back to the code here. And let's check those tags. So if hit info.collider. Whoop, that's not what I meant to select. So I can compare the tag to the ground. And if you remember from the instructions, the ground is the only thing that I can change, only the color. I'm not going to modify anything else for the ground because it's a plane anyway. So that would be a little strange to have the ground be modified. So here we're going to define a color. And then I'm going to call the random color method that I just created to assign that value to it. And then I'm going to assign it to the ground. So I'm going to do hit info.collider.gameObject.getComponent. Now I'm trying to access the renderer. .material.color. And I'm assigning that color that I just defined here, which is going to be hopefully a random color. So I've called the check mouse click in my update. I've defined my check mouse click. I think I defined it correctly. Let's test it out. If I click on the ground, I should be able to change its color. Let's go back to the editor here. Give it a second to update. Press play. And when I click on the ground, it does change color. I can click a bunch of times to make sure it never turns white. It doesn't seem to be. So there we go. We have tested out our random color. Let's go back to the directions now. And let's see what needs to be happening next. So what we're going to do is we're going to work on each of these methods for position, rotate, and scale. And then we're going to assign those to or test them out on the cube. And once we have all of them working, then we're going to deal with what happens when we click on the cube. So, but we're done with the ground, I believe. So we should be good to go. Actually, pick random is only working for the cube. I'm just making sure that I did not mess up anything. So let's work on random position. So here it tells us a vector 3 that has a random float for the x and z position between 0 and 3, but the y needs to be 4. So let's work on random position because it seems to be relatively easy. There it is. So actually we're going to do that before we are setting up the values for our vector 3 to return here. Kind of messed up my alignment. Let me fix that quickly. So let's declare float for x, and then we're going to use random.range. And then it was between 0 and 3. So I'm going to use these values here. Same thing for z, I believe. Between 0 and 3. So far so good. And then the y was the one that was the easiest one because I always want to set that to 4. So instead of returning 0, 0, 0, now I can return x, y, and z. This way I'll have an actual value for my vector and I can save my code. So I should have the proper position. How do I apply that to the cube? So right now we're going to leave pick random alone. And we're just going to test our code to make sure it works. Then we'll deal with pick random, sorry. So let's check if we hit the cube. And let's call our pick random. So I'm going to create a vector 3. I'm going to new position maybe, and then I'm going to call my random position function that will return that vector 3 for me. And then I'm going to assign it to the cube, so that's pretty simple. Hit info dot collider dot game object dot transform dot position equals that new position there. Kind of misspelled the new, that doesn't help. There we go. So I assigned to the position of the object that was clicked a new position. Let's test this out. Again, that's not what's required right now. We're just testing our functions and make sure that they're working as we go. So give it a minute to synchronize. There we go. Press play, and then if I click on it, it should kind of like act like it's jumping and going into a different position. And hopefully, if I check my values for X and Z, I should have values between 0 and 3. And it's jumping, so it seems to be working as expected. Let me go back to my script right quick. So I can comment this out for now. All right, so let's start working on the next one. We did the position, let's work on the rotation. So here for the rotation, let's take a look at the directions. We need to get return of vector 3 as well. Now we need to have higher numbers. We can't have like tiny degrees, or otherwise it's going to be difficult to see the rotation. So if you know degrees, they go from 30 to 300, from 0, sorry, to 360 degrees. But if we rotate just by 0 degrees or 0.5 or 2, we might not be able to see the change. So we're going to pick larger values for those. So let's go into our script. And we need to be able to rotate in all directions. Oh, and look at this. I'm just noticing now that I call this random rotate instead of random scale. All right, I hope you had a good laugh. I need another cup of coffee this morning. All right, so let's work on the random rotation before I get distracted again. We're going to return values x, y, z again. So let's work on x first. So I mentioned that we need to have values that are big enough so we can see. Let's try between 30 degrees. And then we want to use floats. And then let's try 330 degrees. So that'll give you 30 degrees. I think that should allow us to visibly notice the rotation. I forgot my semicolon here. I can do the same thing for y. Actually, I can copy this. And then for z as well. There it goes. Next, I can assign those values to my vector 3 for x, y, z, and it works. Great. So next, we need to call that function here. And we're going to do it in the same place. I'm going to go back into the update where actually the check mouse click. Again, this is going to need to call the pick random, but for now I'm just testing out my code. You got to get into the habit of testing your code. I meant to choose a vector 3. I'm just going to call it rotation, and then I'm going to call random rotation to set it up. I think it's supposed to be called random rotate, but whatever, it's the same thing. And then hit info. So you have to access the game object, the transform, to be able to call the rotate method. Check the Unity documentation, and it's expecting a vector 3 that's called Euler's. I think that's how you pronounce this correctly. And there's basically an Euler vector is providing rotation angles against some axis. So it's kind of like a a vector 3 for a position, but instead of specifying coordinates, it specifies rotation angles. Okay, let's try it out and see if it works. So I'll go back to my editor here and wait for a second for it to synchronize. So now if I hit on the cube, it should rotate it. And I do notice some movement around. So I know it's actually rotating, and it's relatively visible. Now when it rotates around Z, it's a little bit chaotic, but that's fine. And I can see the rotation angles here changing. Now, probably should have left Y alone, but that's fine. All right, last but not least, we have to deal with our scale. I'm going to comment these out. So for the scale here, which I renamed, I had named it incorrectly because I need more coffee. Let's take a look at our editor, not editor, instructions, sorry. And then in the scale, we need to return a vector 3 for X, Y, and Z, and then pick values between 0.1 and 3.0. So that's for all three values. That makes it relatively simple. And the same as we've done before. Random.range used extensively on this assignment between 0.1 and 3.0, and that's for all directions. So I can already copy and paste a little bit here. I'm going to assign the same value for Y and same value for Z. Define my vectors to return to use X, Y, Z instead of those zeros, which would be terrible. So I'll get values in all three directions, and then I need to call that so that I can check that it actually works. So I'm going back to the check clicks here, and I'm going to do the same thing as before. Defining a vector 3, I'm going to call it new scale, and then I'm going to assign to it my random scale method, returning a vector 3 with the new scales, and then I'm going to assign that to the game object. So just as before, hit info dot collider dot game object dot now transform dot local scale is what I need to assign, and I can assign to it a new vector 3, which in my case is the new scale. Now I do this in two lines, but obviously you could be doing that in one line of code, which we'll do when we're done testing him. Okay, let's go back to the editor and test out our scale. Sometimes it kind of messes up a little bit the cube. It seems to be working and affecting the scale. Now it affects also the coordinates due to the rigid body. Okay, now we have all three methods ready to go. It's time to tackle the pick random. Let's take a look at what pick random is supposed to do. It chooses to either randomly change the color, position, rotation, or scale of the cube. So we kind of know how to call the different methods there, but we have to pick a random way. Color, position, rotation, and scale. That's 4 different outcomes. So let's get to our cube here, our script, sorry. And then here I'm going to determine that randomly. So I'm going to define a random number. And then I said there were 4 potential outcomes for the color, the scale, the position, and the rotation. So I'm going to pick a random number using random.range. And then I'm going to pick it between 0 and 5 because I need 4. Well, sorry. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, that would be 5. So 0 and 4. 0, 1, 2, 3 will be 4 outcomes. It's a little bit better. Let's just not try to mess this up. And then here I can either determine to do a switch, or I can use if and else if statements. I'm going to use a switch because it's a little less work, I feel, maybe. And I can add other cases. And then this way I make sure I don't forget anything. Like an else if or something like that. The switch is just like visually, it's a little bit easier to read. So let's start with case 0. Now I can determine to do whatever I want here, but this is where this code is going to come in handy. So 0, let's say we're going to do the, actually I'm going to write this out. Over here, change color, maybe we're going to do. So if we look back at how we changed the color of the ground, that's the only one we changed the color for. We need to have access to the game object here in order to be able to access its color or its position or its rotation, really. But in a pick random, I don't know what hit info is. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to require a parameter. And I'm going to use a game object just to simplify a little bit the and maybe I'm going to call it to change, because that's the game object that needs to change. So here in the case 0, I would have to change, which is a game object, so I can just have straight access this component, the renderer, and then .material.color to access its color property. And I can assign to it a random color. So this is where I told you I'm going to squish that into those two lines. Instead of defining a color and then assigning it, I'm just going to assign straight that random color there. Just and I can break from there. Now let's work on the other cases. For case 1, we're going to change the position. So in this case, to change is a game object. We can access its transform component using the transform lowercase t. And then change the position here after that. And we're going to use random position for it, which is the method that we designed for that. We can break from this case, go into case 2. In that case, we're going to change the rotation. If you remember from our testing earlier, we could access that using the transform component, but the rotate method that's available provided by Unity, we just need to provide the vector 3 in here, which is what our function random rotation was providing. So that works out very nicely. We can break from this case. Then we can have the last case, case 3, where we need to change the scale. And then if you remember, for that we accessed still the transform component, but the local scale. And we could assign that value that we calculated for random scale earlier. And we can break. Okay, one of the things that we're going to do in here, in our example, we're pretty sure that the random number is going to have value 0, 1, 2, 3. Just in case, we're going to add a default case here, and then in our default case we're going to put an error, and you can use log error here, which will display in the console as if it were a runtime error, and then provide a message. We want the message to be specific. Right now in our code we only have one script, so it'll be pretty easy to identify where the error is coming from. But if you are developing a game, there will be a lot of scripts. And so the more specific you are about the location of the error, the easier it will be for you to troubleshoot it. So we can say it's an error, although that's quite obvious because it's a log error. It'll show as an error in the console. In the switch, so that's the switch that's in the function pick random of the game controller. And that's relatively specific. And hopefully that'll direct us directly to this location here. Okay, I think our function is looking pretty good here. Our pick random is looking good. It's got the different cases, an error just in case we hit that default case, which seems highly unlikely, but can never be too safe with your code. The more you plan for potential errors, the better. This way you can quickly identify your errors and then modify them so that your code will be hopefully bug-free. Now all we need is to actually call pick random. So let's go back up to the update. We can delete the code that was there, kind of testing out our code there is no longer necessary. And so I only need to call pick random. But here I'm expecting a game object. So I need to access the game object through hit info, which is relatively simple. We've done that multiple times. Now let's save our code. Let's test it out in the editor now. So I'm going to press play, and then when I click on the ground, it should only change the color. When I click on the cube, it should, well, here it changed its position. Here it changed the color. Change the position again. There's the rotation there. Change the scale. So it seems to be providing a different sets of values. When it goes up in the air, I know it's the position. The color is easy to identify. The scale as well. And then I have the rotation. So one more thing is we haven't finished to connect our buttons. If you remember, we did not connect this. So let's make sure we select from the scene our game controller and pick the function for the quit button and for the reset button. There it goes. Now when I go into run mode and I click on the ground, I'm changing their color. Hopefully that'll be when I click on reset, it resets. If I click on quit, it did say quit application here. It also kind of interacts with the object, which is fine. If I click on the reset button, it seems to be both working on the game object and on the UI. I'm going to give you some information about that. So if you want to avoid, if I click on the UI, I don't want my raycasts going on. There's a way to do that. It's not necessary for this assignment, but I'm going to bring it up since you're going to be needing this maybe for your design games maybe later on. So there is a way, and I don't know if I still have the interface here, the scripting for this. It's an older version, but it's the same. You can check here using event system.current is pointer over game object, and it'll return true if you clicked on the UI. It's a little bit kind of backwards, but that's the way it kind of works. So you need to make sure you import Unity Engine.event systems and then check here. If this returns true, that means you clicked on the UI. And if it returns false, then you have clicked on the game object. It's a little backward and counterintuitive, but and then they're looking for if you provide no parameters there, is assuming you're looking at the left mouse button, which we are. That's what we're doing there. So let's go back to our script and change that a little bit. So I said we need to use Unity Engine .event systems. Oh, it's not going to help me anymore. Event systems is the one that we need to import here. And then I'm going to modify my code a little bit. So before I raycast, I'm going to check what I'm so event dot, sorry, it was event system dot current dot is pointer over game object. So now if I leave it like this, it's considering that I'm on UI. So nothing really needs to happen here. Maybe I can just type in return, and that will allow me to leave the function. And otherwise, that means I'm actually clicking on a game object. That's not UI. And maybe I'm not clicking on anything. And in that case, I can grab my if statement here and bring it in there. I'm actually going to need a new line to do that. There it goes. I'm just going to need to fix some alignment issues here. I only need one. I keep on moving too far. Trying to kind of rearrange my alignment. There it goes. I could have just copied and pasted. It would have been a little faster maybe. Can remove some of these blank spaces that are not really useful. There it goes. So if I click on the UI, it doesn't do anything. And if I click on the game objects or nothing, then nothing happens. So that's kind of like the documentation for this. Let's try it out. It was not a major issue, but so if I click on the button, it does not impact the background. If I click on quit, it says quit the application. It doesn't change the color of the ground. And then if I click on the objects or nothing, then in that case, my code is running as expected. There we have it. That's the end of the lab. We've met all the requirements and a little bit more. Thank you for watching.